I'd like to introduce our presenters. Stephen Ellenbogen, Associate Professor of Social Work. Ellen Janes, Assistant Professor, Social Work. Sulaimon Giwa.
Julia Janes.
Sorry?
Julia Janes.
Julia, sorry.
Yeah,
Assistant Professor, Social Work. Paul Issahaku, Assistant Professor, Social Work. Keith Power, Educational Developer, CITL. Sarah Tremblett, Alumni Social Work.
Tremblett.
Bankovic, Alumni Social Work. I was going to ask actually, because I actually have two friends with that last name, or acquaintances, and they pronounce it differently. Tremblett is one and Tremblay is another.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the floor is yours.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm going to actually start by just handing off the microphone to Keith. That's okay, and he'll.
Did you want to do the land acknowledgement?
Oh yes, sorry. Start with the land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated and are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. There we go. And so now I'll hand it off to Keith.
Sure. Can you move to the first slide?
Sure. Oops. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you. So we begin by situating our presentation within the framework of high impact educational practices. So just to give a very brief description and definition of that, high impact practices are basically a diverse set of educational strategies that draw upon high quality pedagogical practices in the pursuit of 21st century learning outcomes. Now, on the bottom, I've listed a few of those skills that we try and focus on developing for students when we implement a high impact practice. So those include, communication, focusing on both oral and written communication, information literacy, teaching students to be very critical about what they're reading and how they're interpreting information. Also trying to focus on teaching critical thinking and problem solving skills. So here it's looking at developing their own strategies and looking at what strategies work for them. We're also really, focused on developing global awareness and social responsibility as students and as educated people. This is something that we want to bring to the forefront to build a better world for everybody. We also focus on teamwork and collaboration, as we know that this is important in any society, that we work together to solve problems. Another focus is looking at self-learning, becoming aware of who you are as a learner, and then also being able to know what your strengths and your weaknesses are and to develop those. And again, along the lines with global awareness, we look at, diversity awareness and intercultural standing so that we can come to common ground and build a better society. So I'm just going to go to the next slide, please. And when we talk about high impact practices, to date, 11 different types of high impact practices have been identified. But the important part about these practices is that they all involve some kind of applied, hands-on, integrative, and collaborative learning experience. So even though it's defined as a high impact practice, what makes it a high impact practice is that it has these key characteristics. As we move through and we get students engaged in this, again, we're looking at developing deep level processing. So students learn to acquire, synthesize, and apply information. They're also looking at learning through real world problems. And I think that's a really important part here, is that it's not abstract or anything like this, is them engaging with problems that exist in our world today, and that they learn from working through those problems. Another thing is interdisciplinary inquiry. So getting them engaged in multiple areas so that they get to touch on many different topics and learn from others. And that's the next part, is that they actually get to interact with diverse others. So people that are different from them. As we move through this presentation, we're going to be focusing on two specific high impact practices. One is student research, and the other one is community service learning. So for student research, again, here you want to get your students engaged in looking at contested real world issues that we have confronting us today and where we need solutions. Students need to be involved in all aspects of the research. So not just working on the periphery where, you say, okay, I need you to enter this data into a data set. They should be involved in looking at the problem, identifying solutions, finding data, and moving through each process. And another thing is it doesn't have to follow the traditional model where you have, a student, you have the student, and then the student has their supervisor. The supervisor guides the student through. And you'll see that through our presentation that we've taken a very different approach to student research, where the students themselves are the leaders. And then part of this program of education also includes community service learning. And that's where students are going out and they're working with people from different backgrounds and have different demographics. They apply what they're learning in the classroom into the real world. And they help try and actually work with community organizations and partners to overcome different issues. To the next slide, please. And the last thing I'll talk about is some of the key elements that makes a high impact practice successful. So regardless of the high impact practice, it's important that there's high performance expectations for students, that they engage in this kind of activity over a prolonged period of time with lots of effort, that there's a lot of interaction between them, the faculty, and peers, that they have experiences with diversity, that they receive timely and constructive feedback throughout the learning process, that there are structured opportunities for them to reflect and integrate their learning, and that they learn through real world applications, as I've already mentioned. And I think that's really one of the important pieces here. And the last one is that they actually have opportunities to display their competence, their levels of knowledge. And this should become evident throughout our presentation. So I'm going to pass it over to Stephen, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about our project here.
Thank you. So just as a little background, I'd like to acknowledge as well that social work has a long history of using high impact teaching and learning practices. All programs, for example, invest in a significant amount of time and energy into workplace and community-based teaching and learning, specifically placements, and that most instructors are considered to be particularly essential to the training of social workers. And even in our program, there are probably more than half the instructors, if not most of them, engaging in different kinds of high impact teaching and learning practices, as well as community service learning. There's probably 3 or 4 different models of community service learning that are taking place in our program, each with different learning objectives. Certainly a key learning objective for the projects and the program we're describing here is to enable students to apply their learnings and skills in research and critical reflection towards understanding community work issues, or at least issues that are relevant to community-based organizations under the guidance of community partners and instructors. And by encouraging them to apply their education to understanding these complexities in social work and to raise social justice questions, we help students realize a second learning objective, and that is personal and professional growth. Even though there is like ample evidence that high impact teaching practices are effective, and particularly community service learning, most of the literature on community service learning tends to present very large university-wide programs. The downside of focusing on these noteworthy models is that it tends to leave an impression that community service learning is necessarily costly and time-consuming. And we hope this presentation will convince people that this isn't always the case, that you can actually present low-cost and less time-consuming models that have a good impact on students. So just briefly, the community service learning model takes place within the community work, course on community work. And working in teams, students initiate these partnerships with community-based organizations, so they call them up, and they offer this exchange. So through interviews with the CBO personnel, community-based organization personnel, they gain first-hand knowledge about community development policy and related topics, and they write a paper on it that they present in class. And the other part of that exchange is that they prepare a research synthesis paper on a topic chosen by the community-based organization, and this they present to the community-based organization to help advance, something that they're working on typically. Let's see how we're doing for time. Scale-up projects, I'm just going to move to scale-up projects, but I just wanted to point out that I'm calling it a model, but each instructor that delivers it, they add their own particular flavor to the model, and so it affects, how the students learn as well. But I'll just move on to the scale-up projects. So, and I see scale-up projects were made possible through funding, SSHRC funding and public engagement funding. And essentially what we do is we identify promising assignments, so promising partnerships, and then we try to scale them up by turning them into conference papers or turning them into research projects. So leveraging the information into grant applications. And another thing that we do is typically is we need to hire research assistants and other researchers in order to actually realize the project. So I see these scale-ups as a value-added program for instructors who wish to add community-engaged research and knowledge mobilization to their scholarly agenda. So these, of course, they do require a lot more investment. But I find it's advantageous because you can, by only scaling up the promising projects among, the 10 or 20 that we have students do, we can hedge our bets and pursue projects particularly desirable conditions for success, and we're also being able to work on projects that align best with our interests and our capacities. And I find what makes scale-up projects successful is having individuals take ownership of the projects and having the dedication to see it through to the conclusion. So in this lecture, you'll hear from 3 social work faculty and 2 students, each with, sorry, I should have put that forward. So you're going to be hearing from 3 social work faculty and 2 students. Each will discuss, among other things, how community service learning and scale-up projects contribute to their teaching and learning. Although there are some commonalities, I found that each presents a unique perspective. And as a whole, I think it makes a solid argument that community service learning offers worthwhile teaching and learning opportunities, and that scale-up projects offer significant research and knowledge mobilization experiences to all involved. And I will send it back to Keith. That's okay. Yep.
So just quickly, I just want to go back over some of the key characteristics of, a high impact practice. And what I think you'll find evident as we move through the presentation is how each of these different elements were, a part of the Supple Community-Service Learning program and the scale-up projects, and finally the exchange conference that came at the end. And it was these 7, characteristics that guided student learning. So from there, I'm just going to pass it now on to Paul, and we're going to move into describing some of the implementation and go from there. So Paul, please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Keith. So I think I'm highlighting the micro level significance of the community service learning strategy in terms of talking about for students what it enables them achieve. So the question is, so what does it enable students achieve? what knowledge and skills does the CSL enable students, develop? I'm answering this question based on reflections of 4 groups of students in my fall 2021 class, and a group of 20 students in all. Can you move on?
Oh, yep. Sorry.
So these students work with 4 different community-based agencies into reproductive health services, working for the empowerment of indigenous communities, education and job skills training for young people, and then an agency working for the empowerment of persons with disabilities. Right. So based on students' reflections on the pedagogical significance of the CSL, you can highlight 4 key areas. So 4 themes stand out from their reflections on what the CSL enables them actually achieve. They include, a more grounded knowledge and understanding of the issues, the people and communities or context, judgment and decision skills, self-reflexivity and direct practice skills. And these are really key, important, areas of learning and knowledge that we emphasize in social work education. So in the area of grounded knowledge and understanding, students feel that through the CSL projects, course concepts, theories come to life for them in the field. So they help them understand people, issues, and context. So they gain an appreciation of, say, the historical context that shape or influence the issues that communities are grappling with. And so that helps them, that helps shape their attitude and orientation towards a practice. I have extracts from the students, but for the sake of time, I think I will not be reading these excerpts. I will just, comment on them. So in terms of understanding, knowledge and understanding, students indicate that they gain a grounded understanding of social diversity. So not only people and issues, but diversity. I think it's been highlighted in the, the key areas of the high impact project. And to understand that we are not only dealing with diversity in society, but people, individuals have uniquely different needs. So you do not approach service provision with the orientation of one size, fits all. So they gain this type of knowledge either from interacting with, what staff of the CBOs, or interacting with clients in the field, and also drawing from the literature, synthesizing the literature to understand what is going on in the field. Then we come to judgment and decision. So it's really a judgment call to be able to identify strategies for application to practice. And students are able to do this from the research literature that they review and synthesize. So they are able to identify what best practices are there that we should apply, to providing services to our clients. So that calls for judgment, and that is a decision skill that somebody develops as a student. And they indicate that the CSL enables them to gain this type of skill. They are also able to develop the skill of knowing when, how, and where to actually make referrals. And this is an important skill that we require for social work students or would be, graduates. It is important to understand when to make referrals to other services. Maybe the issue is beyond you, or you don't have the resources or capacities to provide the needed service. So when do you do that? When do you make referrals? Students are able to get this through the CSL projects. Then use of self is also an important skill that we require of students. We usually talk about reflexivity in the classroom and maybe discuss it theoretically. It is difficult to teach reflexivity. So students gain this skill through the CSL projects that they go out, to engage with. So they talk about, how it helps them become more culturally humble. So they understand their own biases and how to bracket these biases in their, interactions and engagements with clients. And students even highlight they come to have the orientation of lifelong, learning of cultural humility, to know that you are not competent enough to be able to provide services. So you always are a learner in terms of, how you deal with different groups of people in the society. So if you look at some of the illustrations I have here, you can see what students are actually highlighting as to the key learnings in terms of reflexivity, that comes to light for them in the CSL projects. Can you move on? The final thing I talk about is direct practice skills. So maybe you can ask, what is direct practice skills? What about the other things that we have already talked about? So for frontline social work, practice, you really need to be able to develop relationships, to build relationships, interpersonal, skills with people. And so it is important that students are able to learn to relate with individuals, with groups, families, and communities. And this is what students are talking about in terms of their learning through the CSL projects. They are also able to identify strategies for advocacy. Advocacy is a key something in social work practice. So how do you do it? When do you do it? They are able to learn and acquire all these skills through the CSL projects. So I'll just read. Can you go back a bit? Excuse me. Just read what this student is saying. Our work with the agency provided us with frontline experience and advocacy methods for empowering and developing relationships within vulnerable communities. So that speaks, powerfully to the acquisition of direct practice skills, relating well with people, and actually advocating with and on behalf of others in the end. All right, so you can move on. Okay, so I think I'm just recapping and to emphasize the fact that the CSL strategy is really pedagogically significant for students. And what we are hearing here is coming directly from students who have gone through the experience. So see, it's from the horse's own mouth. Thank you.
So now we're going to shift over to a student who's also going to reflect on experiences with Supple Community-Service Learning. So that would be the characterization of the strategy we're using as being Supple and Scaleup projects. So I will leave it to you, Sarah.
Thank you. So as Stephen mentioned, I was a student who participated in the Supple Community-Service Learning and then also the Scaleup projects moving forward from there. So I'll start by just with some reflections that are more general on the experience of being involved in the projects, and then move into how it's personally influenced my career professionally and academically. So just to begin, I found that participating in this as a bachelor level student in my final semester in the Bachelor Social Work program as well provided me with impactful opportunities for academic and professional growth, and it shaped my career. So based on that, the first thing that I'd like to highlight is the opportunity for Supple Community-Service Learning as a transformative learning process. And when I say transformative learning, I refer to a process that goes beyond knowledge acquisition, and it encourages learners to evaluate and adjust their perspectives, evaluate their understandings, and make meaning through critical reflection. So it's really about not just kind of acquiring that initial knowledge, but moving forward into how does that impact what you know about the world around you and how you interact with the world as a professional and personally. And so CSL facilitates this process because it allows students to become fully immersed in the topic that they're learning through interaction with other students, community organizations, and then the literature piece as well. There are a lot of benefits for students specifically in that it allows them the opportunity to utilize academic experiences to create positive impacts within the community, which does have, it aligns for social work with those core values that the Canadian Association of Social Work has listed in terms of things like social justice and service to humanity and, respect for others. And all of those values can be embodied in the community service learning in terms of not just kind of working in a silo of academia and getting a degree, but actually embodying those values that you will then be expected to uphold as a professional when you graduate. So, and it also allows students to explore different subject areas that perhaps they previously haven't considered, which would be based upon the needs of a community organization. And so moving into the community service learning, it's not just based on what you want to write your paper about, it's about what does the community need right now and how can you use your skill set to benefit that. So I think we can move to the next slide. So just some considerations that based on my reflections for successful and impactful community service learning is that students have varying goals and levels of commitment when it comes to community service learning. So some students are willing and able to commit a lot of time and effort to create a really high level of impact in collaborating with a community partner. For other students, for very, very many various reasons, they may not be in that position. They may not be open, or they may not be able to commit that same level of time and effort into the project. And for them, it may be more about satisfying the course requirements. And so in either circumstance, the process is still having a benefit. At the very minimal level, the process is benefiting the student in terms of satisfying a course requirement and gaining knowledge and understanding, gaining those direct practice skills, and also providing the community-based organization with some sort of information and research in return. So at its basic level, even projects that are not being scaled up still have lots of benefits. But to encourage the creation of projects that might have exceptional outcomes and community partnerships that extend beyond the course duration and move towards that scale-up potential, students should be paired in groups with other students who have similar goals and commitment levels to them. And in my experience, this was more important than the topic itself. So for the group that I worked with, we didn't have the same interests, but we had the same level of commitment in terms of what we wanted to produce for this project. And I found that really had a positive impact on the overall outcomes of the project. And I know, in teaching, choosing groups versus assigning groups is a very kind of different process that everybody has. But in my experiences, allowing students and encouraging students to choose groups based on the level of commitment that they have and their goals for the project allows those participants who really want to produce an exceptional outcome and be able to scale up their project the opportunity to work with other students who do that and challenge themselves in that way, which provides for more kind of advanced projects that have the potential to be scaled up. So just to touch on some of my experiences with the community service learning and scale up projects, as I said, I began doing the project with the fourth year BSW course for community development. My group and I decided to partner with the Blue Door program at Thrive at the time. And at that time, it was a new program and they were looking for support with research that could kind of back their program as a new program, help them find new directions in terms of integrating research into their practice, secure future funding, all of those kinds of things, because they were new. They didn't have a lot of ability to conduct those kinds of research projects themselves at that point. So we saw that as a good opportunity. As I mentioned before, this wasn't a topic that I knew anything about before moving into the project. For those of you who are unaware, the Blue Door program specialized in helping young people escape or leave situations of sexual exploitation. And so, differing that from sex work, but specific to sexual exploitation and those more traumatizing and abusive situations that they want to escape at that time. And so in that process, we collaborated with Melanie Muse, who was leading the program at the time, and then others from Thrive administration for the project. And so we collaborated with them, did our course requirements in terms of presenting the content about the organization, about the program, presenting some research to our class. And then, unfortunately, due to many circumstances, we were unable to get everything completed that we wanted to complete before the end of the course. But because our group had decided that we wanted this to be an impactful experience, we then continued to partner with the organization and did do our presentation well after the course had finished to the organization, presenting the information and getting their feedback on what maybe more they might want. So then a few months later, we began the Scaleup project, which was just continuing that partnership, continuing that research with them. And then at that point, that's where we began incorporating some of the information about that Melanie Muse had given us, and she became one of the collaborators on the project and ultimately a co-author of our conference papers, presenting at the exchange conference with me, which had a really different experience for us to have someone who was the community-based partner at the conference and participating in that kind of level of research. And it really demonstrated the genuine partnership that we were able to complete. And so from there, we were able to publish an article in an online journal and on the Radar. And since then, the essence of the project has continued, and we're working towards scaling up the project towards a paper that'll be published in a peer-reviewed journal. And so the focus of this is on peer support with lived experience. And so moving forward with that, we have Mel, who's being a co-author on that paper with myself and Stephen and some others. And so just to conclude, for me personally, this Supple Community Service Learning has helped me to understand the possibility of blending academia and social work practice. I viewed these as two separate kind of pathways in my career and was unsure of where I wanted to go next when I was finishing my bachelor. But after completing that, I realized that the academic work can have a direct impact on services and practice provided for social work. So I embraced the idea of finding out from professionals and community organizations what research would actually be useful for them to have, which inspired my independent study project for my master's at McGill. I wanted to complete a project that would have a direct impact and that would utilize skills of knowledge translation and collaboration and academic research for people to actually take and consume that information and make use of it. And so I worked with Dr. Nico Chakme on creating and updating publications describing child welfare systems in every province across Canada for the Canadian Child Welfare Research Portal, and then completed a comparison and contrast for that. And just to conclude, I'm hoping to complete my PhD and drawing from my past experiences, my future research ideas will also involve community engaged projects that produce knowledge that benefit partnering organizations. And so talking about ownership of knowledge created and how I can use academic and research skills that I have to highlight and bring forward the important information that community members have to share. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was wonderful. So I'm going to pass it on now to Julia and Tina, who are going to talk about some other scale-up projects. We might not have time at the end for questions, so but we're going to have our emails there, and you can just email us directly in case we have to kind of just cut off at the end of the presentation. Okay, off to you, Julia and Tina.
Thank you, Stephen. So we are going to both talk about a community service learning project and a scale-up project, but we're going to begin with the Supple Community Service Learning projects from the perspective of community, students, and instructors. I have the privilege of co-presenting with Tina, who was in one of our classes, our community class, is an alumnus graduate now, and is also working with us on the Scaleup project as a research assistant. So she has that dual lens in the same way that Sarah has been describing. So what I'm hoping to begin with is a bit of a deep dive into the community perspective on these projects. Even though we are clearly focused on student learning, one of the hallmarks of doing this kind of pedagogy is that it has reciprocal benefits to both community and students. So we want to pick up on, this is a table that Stephen, I believe, is using to frame the Supple Community Service Learning. And we want to particularly attend to the reciprocal knowledge gains, which both Paul and Sarah have spoken about, as well as the reciprocity of and relational skills that are built between the students and the community partners. Next slide, please. So in the 4 years that I've been teaching the communities course and using a CSL, I would say as an overview, the feedback that the community partners give us, which is a component of the grade, has been nothing short of outstanding, both in terms of the quantitative ranking of various aspects and engagements within the project, but also the qualitative feedback. And I'm just going to share a couple of the qualitative feedbacks from those forums from the fall term. And I just want to draw your attention to the reciprocity of the knowledge gains that this community partner highlights, speaking about how the students provided a wealth of information to draw from as we created our program. More importantly, they truly understood our needs and placed focus on liability, training, and management side of developing a volunteer-run transportation program. So this was very pragmatic distillation of the research to an application to the development of programming that was leveraged to secure funding for a volunteer-run transportation program. So you can see how meaningful that knowledge was to the community partner. Next slide, please. Here I want to really highlight the relational benefits, which Paul framed as direct practice skills, really about navigating and communicating and developing shared understandings within an ethos of care even. And we can hear from this community partner, it was similar to looking in a mirror and seeing the passion and enthusiasm and dedication I bring every day to my work in the students presenting their research. I was overwhelmed at times by how caring the students were. So I just wanted to highlight from the perspective of community partners, there are both those very concrete, tacit knowledge gains, but there are also these relational pieces that are woven together and are taken forward by both students and our community partners. Next slide, please. I think Sarah mentioned the conference. So I'll just draw back because I'm not sure that we've given any context to the conferences. There have been 2 annual conferences where students have been invited to either present or create research posters to further disseminate their findings. So here we see that broader opening up of the knowledge that they've gleaned beyond sharing it with an individual community partner to a broader base of community partners during these 2 conferences. So in some ways, I think Keith has framed it, this is sort of the first tier of the scale up for many of the projects. And Tina's was one of the projects on volunteering in a rural context. And the poster was presented in 2020 conference.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to turn it over to Tina just to reflect more generally on her experiences and learnings as a student doing a Supple CSL.
Great. Next slide, please. So just to introduce myself, I am a registered social worker, but a really recent alumni. I graduated 1 year ago, May 2021. So it's been a really interesting experience to reflect on my learnings in this course, specifically with 1 year of community work under my belt. And I think a lot of what I learned in the class is really clear now that I'm actually in the workforce. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through a few learnings, and I just invite you to kind of, as I'm going to give kind of pretty specific examples from my project. So I just invite you to think about how they connect to some of the other concepts that have been brought up, the idea of deep level processing, of self-learning, etc. So just want to preface my points here by saying what I think that this course does is it gives you an opportunity to use lenses you might not have the opportunity to use when you're a practicum student. So I know that certainly when I was on practicum, I was so client focused, so focused on the person in front of me, so focused on their needs, and also on my own skills, right? Am I doing all the things I learned in class? You know, are we connecting? You know, just really focused on that relationship. And there's not always bandwidth to think about some of these broader dynamics. But these broader dynamics are what I learned about in this course. So as Julia mentioned, our project was, we partnered with an organization that wanted to recruit and retain volunteers in rural parts of Newfoundland and Labrador. So in doing this project, the lenses that I sort of fine-tuned here are number one, the ability to think critically about volunteerism and charity models. So if you're doing community work, I think it's really important to keep this frame in mind, right? So, you know, a lot of our agencies wouldn't be able to function without our volunteers, without our donors. We want to keep them engaged. But at the same time, when we construct our clients as in need and our volunteers and donors as their only hope, we're obscuring other opportunities for action, right? At the systemic level, at the political level. So as champions of social justice, social workers need to keep that tension on their radar. That's something I learned to do here in this course. Also, just this idea of when we engage volunteers, is this community engagement, or is it a downloading of social services onto the community sector, onto the unpaid workforce? This is something that I see all the time in our day-to-day work. And it's just, I think, really important to go into this line of work, being able to kind of zoom out and look at what's actually being asked of us here, right? And how do we navigate that without impacting our clients? The biggest learning for me was actually point number 2, gaining an understanding of organizational dynamics. So I'm going to illustrate this with a really brief example. When we went to present our research, we found that actually our partners knew some of the stuff and some of the suggestions we were bringing forward. And we learned that what was actually going on was that their organization had recently expanded, and some of the old methods, the tried and true methods that they had for communicating with volunteers no longer worked, because they now had to send all of their communication through a marketing team, which wasn't the case before. So while that, what that taught me was just this idea of, like, again, zooming out and looking at what is going on elsewhere in the organization, how is it impacting my work? And also just learning to kind of, like, for lack of a better way of putting it, diagnose the issue correctly, because they presented us with a volunteer recruitment issue that was perhaps more of a communication issue. And this kind of stuff can happen when you're in a community organization that's rapidly expanding. So I found it really, really useful to enter community core work with that lens. Next slide, please. And finally, just the idea of thinking critically about growth and context. So when we expand, and again, we see this in community organizations, what do we lose? We may gain, we do gain a lot, but we're conditioned to think that growth is exclusively a good thing. But it's important as social workers to think about what here is already working that we might risk losing as we expand. So just to summarize those 3 learnings, I would say that this assignment really offered me an opportunity to use a wide angle lens that you might not be able to, like, use to sort of develop when you're on practicum, because your work is a bit more specific. And I want to circle back now to what Julia was talking about, just this idea of relational and reciprocal benefits. And I have an example from the project of that as well. So as I said, when we brought forward our findings, the response was actually initially a little bit lukewarm. Some of the team we were presenting to, they already knew some of this stuff. But what really shifted was 2 of us in the group had actually previously worked as volunteer coordinators. So we kind of had to really quickly pivot, and we're going to talk more about the importance of pivoting in our when we talk about our Scaleup project. But we really quickly pivoted and started talking about some of the stuff that had worked in our careers. And it was really interesting to see, like, that's when the sparks were lit, and you could see, like, our partners kind of, ramped up a bit, and we're just kind of, it became a real back and forth, energized conversation. And that's something that only emerged in a relational context. So while the research we did brought us there and helped build that relationship and spark that conversation, I think it was just really that face-to-face, that relationship that helped that moment of mutual learning happen. And for us students, it was really good to know that sometimes you can do that. Sometimes you can just informally say, here's what's working, and go from there, especially in community where things move so fast. So I'm going to turn it back to Julia to elaborate more on the relational benefits.
Thank you so much, Tina.
Okay, yeah, for the final project, I'm wondering if you can just kind of do it in 3 or 4 minutes, just so we can leave also
Absolutely,
some time
yeah.
for Sulaimon. Would that be okay?
For sure.
So
We actually have just one more, maybe I'll try to keep it to one more slide on this.
Oh, we
on
can
the
do
Supple
the
Community
cannabis
Service
harm
Learning.
reduction too, but just, yeah, brief overview maybe.
Sure, absolutely. Next slide. So,
Oh,
yes,
next one.
so I'm just going to very briefly talk about the shift from knowledge synthesis to knowledge mobilization. Okay, so what I wanted to finish with is an acknowledgement, as Stephen said, that things evolve over time for instructors in response to community partners and in response to student learnings. And one thing that's been happening in the sections that I've been teaching is community partners are increasingly asked for the knowledge, the research synthesis to be adapted and applied to real-world resources, pamphlets, posters, training modules. And this shift has really been driven by the partners and has created some tensions in what's doable within a time-limited term, what is doable in terms of students' learning outcomes, because often what the partner wants and the students are able to achieve are not in synergy. And we've had to navigate that. But I just want to highlight a few times when that navigation actually led to something pretty wonderful. Next slide, please. So this was a project where the community partner asked for research on youth and psychosis, and then asked the students to distill it into a pamphlet for staff who were supporting youth and psychosis. So they distilled the literature in a very visually sharp and accessible resource for training of new staff. Next slide. And here's another example of a group that was asked to design a poster for intentional and inclusive outreach. And it had to come back to me, and we had to have a deep dive discussion about how is the research going to scaffold this. And they were able to do it. They were able to research social justice messaging and communication, visual design that's accessible and inclusive. And they were able to do both the research synthesis and distill it into this very compelling poster that has been used by SHOP going forward. So I just wanted to highlight that shift and sort of the adaptations that are being made. We're now moving into the Scaleup project, with a full disclosure that neither Tina or I were involved in the Supple Community-Service Learning project that this emerged from. Next slide. Just a very brief overview. It came from a Supple CSL in a partnership with Daybreak Parent and Child Center. There were 3 BSW students who were involved in responding to the community partners' ask for research on the possible risks of cannabis use for parents and how they as service providers might better support female cannabis users from a harm reduction perspective. Funding was secured. It's nested within CHR, and the project was scaled up in the beginning to first with the MSW student conduct a more lengthy scoping review and then get into actual data collection, primary data collection. I'm going to skip out on this slide, Stephen. It's just there have been 6 students from entry level all the way up to MSW who have been involved in various aspects of real-time primary data collection and analysis. Unlike research synthesis, they are actually enabled in developing real-time research skills. And I'll turn it over to Tina to talk about what that looks like.
Okay, perfect. So next slide, please. So just really quickly, I want to link it back to what Julia was talking about with the relational benefits, because we have found both opportunities and challenges connected to our relationships with this particular organization. What we have found is that the people who initially design, like in community, when you have your sort of project champions move on into different roles, into different organizations, that can present both opportunities and challenges. Actually, Stephen, can I just get you to skip ahead to the next slide? I might be able to better demonstrate this with looking at what has worked and hasn't worked. So we've run into quite a few challenges just with recruiting for this project. What we found, initially we did all the kind of traditional things, community email blasts, newsletters, social media, including very targeted social media to, participants that we thought would be really interested and haven't gotten much response. What we found that has worked was people that we already have relationships with, okay, and not just organizations, but like specific people. So what has worked is partnering with a community agency that has a history of holding on-site community engagement initiatives. We were able to to hold a focus group by focusing on that particular relationship. Having an in-house project champion, right? So this is where we got to use a bit of caution, because you don't want to get into having a service provider recruit for your study, but having someone able to communicate their support and enthusiasm in-house has really worked for us. And we also got an excellent response from our field instructor email. So again, going back to this relationship issue, people that are invested in the School of Social Work, not just in harm reduction, but also in our school and in the work that we do. So I would just, my big learning from this: proceed with caution. You want to leverage those relationships, but not overstep. I think we're going to turn it over to the next project now.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Sulaimon, I will just let you take the lead now. You might be on mute.
We were under 50.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me now?
There you go. I can hear you now. Yes. Excellent.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. So one additional scale-up research project that we undertook with a community partner is related to the experiences of pediatric oncology campaign for children and families affected by childhood cancer. And so for the research, we partnered with the Candlelighters Association of Newfoundland and Labrador, and we conducted a study that was based on their Camp Delight. So Camp Delight, I don't know if many people know what Camp Delight is an 8-day, essentially, it's an 8-day camp that is offered overnight for to the Candlelighters Association of Newfoundland and Labrador. And it is a sole pediatric oncology camp operating in Newfoundland and Labrador, and it's available to children between the ages of 5 and 17 years of age who have been diagnosed with cancer, their siblings, and also bereaved siblings. In many ways, it's an opportunity for those children and their families to be able to experience camp with other children without feeling limited by the medical status. And also, too, there's the opportunity for qualified supervision from camp and medical staff who are also on site to provide those services to those campers, including transportation to Janeway for medical services when that is required. Next slide, please. It is significant to also note that this was a university community partnership with the Candlelighters Association of Newfoundland and Labrador. And in addition, it was also a student and community-led research and engagement process, which I'll explain a bit more in the next slide, in the subsequent slide. But I think it's also noteworthy to say that there was an opportunity to co-create knowledge that would positively shape the camp experiences for families and children affected by cancer. And we had several research goals that we were seeking to address, one being to understand the experiences of families and children attending Camp Delight. The second was to identify factors that influence parents' children's decision to return to camp. And to also, the third one was to identify barriers to attendance or participation in Camp Delight. And then the last one was to provide recommendations to enhance services and attract new membership. Next slide, please. So the partnership took sort of like an organic, what I would consider to be an organic form. And this was reflected in the process by which community university partners collaborated to meet the objectives of the research study. The process that was followed in our engagement looked something like the diagram that you see on the screen there. It is worth mentioning, however, that the partners did not set out to follow these specific pathways. yet they allowed us to be able to move from one stage to the next, and not always in a linear fashion. So we began with planning and identifying the requirements we needed to be able to meet the research needs of the community partner. And then from there, we moved to the design and the conceptualization stage. Then we had the implementation stage where we were collecting the data. And then there was the analysis and the writing of the data that we collected. And then there was the process of dissemination of knowledge. Again, I want to really emphasize that this was not a linear process, and that there were moments where we were moving from one stage to another and back again. And we saw this particularly with the analysis and the writing, but also the dissemination stage where we got feedback from the community partner. And then we had to go back to the analysis stage to kind of incorporate it and integrate some of those feedback into the final report that we created. Next slide, please. At this point, I want to pivot quickly to talk about some of the practical benefits of this Scaleup research project for student learners. One of the practical benefits is the opportunity to put classroom learning into action. And I think you've already heard from my other colleagues here who gave the presentation in terms of how that manifested itself. But I think it's important to underscore that this was really in real time, right? So they've actually taken the learning from the classroom and now are able to implement it in real time at the community level. And for some of the students that were involved with this particular initiative, this was some of the first real occasion for them to be able to contribute to actionable deliverables for program and policy consideration. It was also an opportunity to learn and implement behind the scene work on a successful research project. So here we're thinking about things like the literature review, the data collection, data analysis, like all the heavy lifting that happens to the implementation of a full-fledged report that then gets submitted to the community partner. And then it's also an opportunity for these students to contribute to the development of an academic paper for journal submission and publication, which is really where we are at the moment. And lastly, I would like to underscore that this experience also solidifies students' relationship with community partners for future research. So these are individuals that community partners can actually begin to look to for any future opportunities for research that they may want people to help them, address. So those were the practical benefits that I could identify for students. Next slide, please. I do apologize that I'm speaking fast. I have to attend another conference that I'm presenting at, and I'm already kind of running a bit late, so bear with me. The practical benefits to community partner, I think it's also important to mention what these are. For one, the partnership provided an opportunity for synergy between on-the-ground practice knowledge of community partner and research knowledge of university partner, which resulted in the right research questions being investigated. I think this was really, really important that the synergy was there between those two entities. Also, active involvement and investment of time by community partner throughout the research also ensured meaningful return on investment. And by this, what I'm really speaking to is the active engagement of the several community partners that were part of the, I guess you could say, steering committee of the project, where we were talking about what the specific research question would be, what would be the particular methods that we use to answer the research questions. So they were really active in that process in terms of sharing ideas and providing feedback in terms of how we should be moving forward. The next one is evidence-based research to also inform camp program design, delivery, and effectiveness in meeting the organization's goals for campers. Ultimately, the organization really wanted to know whether or not the Camp Delight was actually meeting the needs that they had originally set out. And I think by the research that we conducted, we were able to then provide evidence-based research to actually inform that organization in terms of the direction that they want to take the particular program. And finally, I think that there was a piece around improved awareness about the different aspects of the research process. And I think this was really, really important because sometimes there is a schism between the community and the university partners around, the speediness with which research happens. And I think sometimes there's a learning curve that needs to happen on the part of the community in terms of understanding the processes and the different stages that is involved in terms of creating good research, which is the slide that I'm going to end on. The next slide, please. And I think, again, the message here is that good research really takes time. So from the research question to the recruitment and data collection, to the data analysis, and to the actual report writing. These are the kind of steps that we had to kind of go through. And I think through the exercise that we engage in with the community partner, they were able to actually see in real time again what that process looks like. Again, I do apologize. I need to leave now.
Thanks, Sulaimon.
Thank
No
you.
problem. Thank you.
And I apologize for taking a little longer than we hope to. But just pointing out that these are some of the partners, and if you want questions, I know we don't have time for a question period, but you can always note down the address, or when it's after it's posted online, you can certainly contact us a little later on. But thank you all for attending.